New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the bill before us has often been referred to in these couple of weeks since it was first submitted as the Progressive Conservatives' Plan B with respect to Northern Pulp. I want to take the occasion of the bills being debated this afternoon to make a few comments on what should have been Plan A. First, let me say a word about the perspective that I bring to this question. I don't have the experience of working at Northern Pulp or in the woods or in any sawmill. I've never lived in Pictou, although two of my children were born there, and I certainly don't have the wealth of personal relationships and experience to bring to this question that the members from Pictou County have. I do, however, have a perspective. For the biggest part of my adult life, I was the minister to the United and Presbyterian churches of the upper end of the Musquodoboit Valley. And through most of those years, until its bankruptcy in the Great Downturn, Upper Musquodoboit was home to the largest sawmill east of Montreal, Macterra, a mill which was deeply financially integrated with Northern Pulp. Macterra lumber defined the community, and mill workers, contractors, chip truck drivers between Upper and Abercrombie, operators of harvesters and porters and feller bunchers defined the congregations that I served. And in addition, from 2009 to 13, I served Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley as its MLA and had an opportunity, especially in the context of the discussions around the natural resource strategy in those years, to work quite closely with some of the main mills which today are living under the shadow of uncertainty surrounding Northern Pulp, such as Ledwidge's, Sproul's, and Taylor's in Middle Musquodoboit. It is the perspective of these thousands of jobs that informs the comments that I want to make now. My late father, whenever someone would come to him with a really gnarly, difficult decision or problem, would often start the conversation by saying, well, what are the considerations? The first consideration in dealing with the Northern Pulp situation, in my view, is that we are dealing with a company which, together with its predecessor corporations, has, to an extent that is actually quite rare in Nova Scotia, squandered its social license. What I mean by social license is that general sense without which it's very difficult for a company to make its way in a community, that company is at some fundamental level trustworthy, or at least an entity with which people can play ball and do business. Scott, Nina, Kimberly-Clark, Northern Pulp, all of them over half a century, mistreated the great asset of that trust. Certainly this is true amongst contractors, all of whom have understood that if at least one of them didn't go under every year, then the company would take that as a sign that they were paying too much in the rates. The same is true for truckers. It's particularly true at the level of the community of Pictou County, with whom the mill has had a relentless record of evasion and non-transparency with respect to its emissions. This is true in a way that does not appear to have ever been true, say, with Stora or with Bowater. I think of a friend of mine from Westville who was telling me the other day about his mother's view of the mill. His mother is a woman who was married to a coal miner and who, when he was growing up, when the coal dust got all over the clothes on the line, would prohibit anybody in the family from complaining. She would just take the washing and do it again because that went along with jobs. But that woman, my friend said, when asked now about the current controversy with Northern Pulp, said in a very pointed way, I hope they shut it down. That's not my view, I want to be clear, but it is striking that it's her view. Or I think of a highly respected professional in Pictou with whom I was talking this over recently, who kind of half snarled, they've got their nerve asking for an extension. These are the kinds of conversations that happen when a company has squandered its social license. And I have heard it said in the company's defense that that was the predecessors, that Paper Excellence is doing much better on this front. And that may well be, but I must say that this wasn't very much in evidence when, say, the New Glasgow bookstore was pressured over holding a launch for Joan Baxter's book, nor when the company's social gathering was removed from a venue because of its association with Friends of the Straight, nor most recently in January, when Northern Pulp held its press conference announcing the submission of its effluent proposal on the very morning marking the community celebration of the year before the closing of Boat Harbour and Pictou Landing. This is the first consideration. The second consideration, in my view, is that in such a situation, when a company is so broadly mistrusted, the government is especially responsible to ensure that any proposal from that company with a major environmental impact is subjected to the highest level of scrutiny, assessment, and review. Nothing less in such a situation can be expected to lead to the level of public assurance that is much of the purpose of having an environmental assessment. Nova Scotia's Class 1 environmental assessment system simply lacks the general scope and the robustness to lead to this level of public assurance and acceptance. Class 1 reviews have been widely criticized for a kind of small-scale perfunctoriness, a consultant study here, a consultant study there, a dash here and there of community consultation. Even the Auditor General has raised a skeptical eyebrow about Class 1 environmental reviews, pointing out not long ago the extent of the Department of Environment conditions and stipulations that are never followed up on. The Northern Pulp effluent question, that is, has been a perfect candidate for a broader, deeper, far more thoroughgoing level of environmental review. A Class 2, at the very least, or as I have come to believe, would ultimately make more sense, an environmental review at the federal level. The government's insistence on the Class 1 constricted form of environmental review of the Northern Pulp effluent proposal has been a major error of judgment because it cannot lead to the generalized level of legitimacy at the community level, which is a significant part of what is aimed for with a successful environmental assessment. Consideration 3 is that the Liberal government, in my view, has been culpable and negligent in its having allowed Northern Pulp to fail to bring forward a proposal in such time as would have allowed for a broader, more thorough and extensive review. Over and over in the legislature, as the clock ticked past 2016, 17, 18, ministers of the environment were questioned about what they were doing to ensure that a Northern Pulp proposal was brought forward. And time again, the answer was, no, not us. That has nothing to do with us. There's no role here for us. We have to wait until the company brings forward its proposal. And so that's what they did. Wait and wait and wait, as though the words responsible and government never really belonged together, while the time went by which they could have provided for the level of review the situation called for within the framework of the Boat Harbour Act. And what hurt and what a miserable cloud of uncertainty has been brought over so many thousands of people by this willfully negligent government approach. Everyone who works at the mill is certainly affected. I met recently with a delegation from Unifor, Northern Pulp's mill union, and I left the meeting with a sense of hot-stomached rage that the Liberal government has permitted those 250 people to be put in this position. Everyone who works at a sawmill that sells residuals to Abercrombie absolutely is affected. I think about a friend of mine in Pleasant Valley, Halifax County, where most people who don't work in the woods work at Taylor's Mill, and who, when he talked about what could happen, thought about the community and said simply, well, it'll put everybody I know out of work. Then we can think of all the people who work for contractors out of all these mills, many of whom are working with gear today so worn out that it's impossible for them to make any money, but who in the present uncertain climate cannot reinvest in new equipment. Everyone who owns a woodlot is affected as they face the impact of potential loss of value. Everyone whose living is related to the Northumberland Strait fishery is utterly, of course, affected, and everyone in Pictou County has been affected as the fabric of wonderful, strong communities has been ripped at, torn at, and clawed at by division on this question. And why? Because the Liberal government failed to carry out its responsibility. The responsibility of a government is not just words on a plaque behind them on a wall. It means that the government's role is to determine the course of action most in keeping with the interests of the people they serve, and then to contribute to that action and that outcomes taking place. I have heard the Premier on occasion say, oh, if the people of Pictou County come together and, but the government is not the people of Pictou County. I've heard the Premier say, oh, if the 3 Pictou County MLAs wanted to amend, but the government is not the 3 Pictou County MLAs. I've even heard it said, well, if there were thus and such a view in Pictou Landing, but the government is not the people of Pictou Landing. The government is the Premier and these 26 others who asked the people of our province for the privilege of carrying out the responsibility of governing, a privilege which they received and then did not carry. They put it down. They threw their hands in the air and said, no, no, not us. And as a consequence of the negligence of this evasion, large parts of Nova Scotia today are living in a vice. Consideration 4 and final. None of this terrible failure of responsibility and leadership at the corporate and at the government level is the fault of anyone in Pictou Landing. I was privileged to attend the celebration January 31st at the Pictou Landing School, marking 1 year until the closing of Boat Harbour. The auditorium was full in more ways than one. It was full of meaning as a procession of children spoke about the importance of the recovery of what in Mi'kmaq is called Oseg, Boat Harbour. The auditorium was full of memory as a timeline along the school's auditorium wall marked the 52 years of Boat Harbour with the pictures of community members who had passed away and had not lived to see this day. The auditorium was full of words with power. As Chief Andrea Paul said through tears, I quote, "What does this mean? It means we are turning back the colonization they forced on us. That end date is so sacred to us. 52 years that we carried this. What a wonderful victory that Boat Harbour is resurrecting back into Oseg. All of Nova Scotia should be able today to be partaking of that joy without divided minds, without conflicted thoughts, without economic fears. And that's where we would have been if the government had not fallen so far short on what should have been Plan A. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.